Good morning, everybody. Welcome back to part 5 of our 6-part series entitled Multilingual Learners at the Forefront in California's Math Framework. This is facilitated by the wonderful Dr. Julianne Foxworthy-Gonzalez. My name is Renee Scarin, and I'm Senior Advisor of Content at the English Learner Success Forum. If you recently signed up for our series and missed the first few sessions, check out the follow-up email that we send out with links to the videos and tons of resources for you to use in both your adoption and implementation practice, as well as those content developers looking to design materials with the California Math Framework in mind. Please also stay till the end and take our survey. The surveys really help us to learn a little bit more about what you're looking for and what your needs are. So we'd really appreciate it if you do that. Dr. Foxworthy is going to share some insights about how we can build and implement instructional materials that really elicit and build on the assets and immense potential that our multilingual learners bring to school. But first, if you're just tuning into ELSF's resources, I wanted to share a little bit about what we do. ELSF is really committed to enhancing equity and access for our nation's 5 million designated English learners or multilingual learners. Next slide. Our particular focus is on the design, adoption, and implementation of high-quality instructional materials that are responsive to all learners, including the culturally and linguistically diverse students that attend today's schools. Slide 4. Our expertise focuses on actionable pathways and tools for content developers to fully enact high-quality curriculum for multilingual learners. And so we also educate curriculum adoption decision makers on the selection of instructional materials that support multilingual learners. So we work with states and cohorts of districts and county offices to really support the adoption process and making sure it's responsive to all of our students so that they can meet their academic potential. And now I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Foxworthy-Gonzalez so she can walk us through assets-based curriculum for multilingual learners. Take it away.
Thanks, everyone. Good morning. Like I said, I hope you had a nice long weekend if you got to have one, and that you're raring to go this morning to talk about what is one of the most important and often overlooked aspects of what curriculum materials can do to support our multilingual students. And we're going to start right off from the top with this quotation from the California Math Framework. It says that educators at all levels need to take action to challenge deficit thinking, draw on rather than exclude students' identities, cultural backgrounds, and create classrooms that foster active instead of passive learning experience. And let's just get ourselves going, interacting with one another right off the bat this morning. And if you would, drop a few words into the chat about what deficit thinking is. We throw this term around all the time in education: deficit thinking, deficit framing. But what does that mean to have deficit thinking or a deficit frame in the classroom? Go ahead and drop something in the chat. What comes to mind for you? We've got some good things popping up right away. Yeah, those students can't do it. Or when people talk about my low kids, it's a focus on what students can't do. It's believing that only some can learn, basically being negative, or but they don't have this and they don't know that. Maybe thinking they don't care. Again, that language of low kids. Ooh, I like this from Megan, deciding where the ceiling is for students. That idea that my students can't do that, my students won't be able. It's looking more at what students don't know than what they do know. The idea, Jody, yes, that I need to simplify everything, make it simple for them. Oh, the pobrecitos. thinking about what they don't have instead of what they do have. That language about home involvement is really prevalent in the schools that I worked at. Those families don't care. Those families don't care about education. They don't have any support at home, right? And thank you, Tamara. It can be explicit or implicit. And that's going to be a really important idea today. I want to share with you a quotation from someone. This is David Wagner. He's out of the University of New Brunswick up in Canada, and incidentally, a member of my dissertation committee. And he had what I thought was a lovely definition of deficit thinking. The idea that one's own way of speaking or thinking is superior. So implicit in all of those ideas that we were dropping into the chat, we have the idea that it's not just that we're thinking those kids can't or this kid can't, but we're also assuming that the my way or the like normative way of thinking, speaking, engaging with mathematics, thinking about mathematics, that's superior. That's the norm to which all students should adhere. Instead of opening our ideas and opening our minds to all the different ways that humans can think and speak about mathematics. So it's not just thinking other people can't, but it's the idea that there's only one standard that should be met, and it's the dominant standard. It's my standard. It's English. It's white. It's upper middle class. All those ideas, and that's where the deficit thinking comes from, right? That there has to be this idea of superiority to think that someone else is low, someone else is incapable, something like that. Someone else's family doesn't care. That presumes that there's this standard that everyone should attain. And so that's what we're going to counter today. We're going to think deeply about all those insidious ways that deficit thinking can unintentionally creep into our teaching and into our curriculum, and what we're going to do to challenge it and to interrupt those taken for granted ways of creating curriculum, those taken for granted ways of teaching that have this deficit thinking sprinkled throughout. Because of course, we want students to develop mathematical language. Of course, we want them to develop conceptual understanding of canonical big ideas in mathematics. But it's that key that of the own way of speaking and thinking. So it's not about students shouldn't have access to, or students shouldn't speak with the precise vocabulary. We've seen in other webinars that we demand that students learn the precise vocabulary. We don't want to simplify things for them so they don't have access to it. But the ways they get to that, the ways they make meaning, the ways they investigate and solve a problem, there are many pathways to do that. And we're going to focus on how we can help teachers elicit those unique and interesting paths that their students think about in class. So we're going to start with a little video. I'm not sure how many of you know who Francis Su is. He was the president of the American Mathematics Association and gave a lovely keynote address at the end of his term as president called Mathematics for Human Flourishing. And if you haven't seen it and you're a math person, I encourage you to go watch it or listen to it or read it. It's a lovely speech. And in that speech, he talks about how mathematics can promote various human virtues. And he talks about hope and beauty and love and play, these things that humans naturally strive for, that mathematics is an avenue to access all of those human virtues. And I'm going to show you a little clip that I think is particularly relevant to our discussion today about deficit thinking, right? And about the idea of who's allowed to be in mathematics. So let me come over here.
Here's another deep human desire, the desire for justice. Now, my favorite Chinese restaurant serves authentic Chinese food, just like my parents used to make. And when you order an entree, they bring you an appetizer and a dessert as well. And it's a bargain, so I don't complain that the appetizer and the desserts are not themselves authentic Chinese cuisine. The dessert is like this little piece of Jell-O, and the appetizer are these crunchy noodles, which aren't really authentic. But one day I went to my this favorite restaurant with a Chinese-speaking friend. I don't speak Chinese personally. I went with this Chinese-speaking friend, and when the appetizer came, it wasn't the crunchies, but it was these delectable pickled cucumbers. Yet my friend had not made any special request. And when the dessert came, it was red bean soup, just like my mom used to make. How come I hadn't gotten this before? I wondered. And I began to see a pattern. When I came to this restaurant with non-Asian friends, I would get the crunchies and the Jell-O. But when I came with Asian friends, I got the good stuff without even asking. And then I noticed that my Chinese friends were offered a completely different menu, a secret menu with the more authentic dishes. And I looked around the restaurant. I beheld a bizarre sight, people side by side in the same restaurant having very different experiences. Non-Asians ordering from the standard menu and getting Jell-O, but Asians ordering from the secret menu and getting red bean soup. Now, I was told, even when I asked for this menu because I knew about it, no, you won't like the stuff on that menu. You see, even though I'm of Chinese descent, the waiters had assumed because I speak perfect English that I must not be interested in the authentic Chinese food. Now, why do I tell this story? It's because mathematical spaces in the home or in the classroom can be like this restaurant. Whom do we allow a peek at the secret mathematical menu? With whom do we share our mathematical delights? Puzzles, games, toys? Do we share them more with our son than our daughter? Whom do we let into our information circle about math? Whom do we shepherd towards doing more mathematics, and whom do we discourage? What conscious or unconscious assumptions are we making? You see, justice means treating people fairly, and it's required for human flourishing. We flourish, we experience shalom when we treat others justly and when we are treated justly. And Simone Weil realized that correcting injustice must involve changing how we view others. And so if you believe that mathematics exists to help people flourish, you'll realize if you just look around that the demographics of those who do math, or even in the science professions, they don't look like the demographics of America. Right? We've kept somehow whole segments away from the flourishing that's available, either by lack of access or by explicit messages of disapproval. And so to seek justice in mathematics is important. How do we give people an opportunity to flourish in mathematics? And it builds many virtues, among them a concern for the marginalized, a willingness to challenge the status quo. You see, when we begin to see how our experiences are different from our neighbors, we will want the secret menu for everyone. Here's another basic human desire, the desire for freedom. You may not think of freedom.
All right. Francis Sue giving us his wisdom. What do y'all think? Any thoughts pop up? I like this metaphor of the secret menu. I think that it's a really nice way to give a metaphor about the way math class can feel to us sometimes. I teach a class for undergraduates and they're all terrified of mathematics. It's a statistical literacy class, and they all come in having been denied the opportunity to see the secret menu, denied the opportunity to see the fun, the joy, the beauty, the intellectual excitement that can happen when math is meaningful. And we have the opportunity to make meaning in math, to use mathematics to think about our world and impact our world, right? And And some folks, we assume, right, that they belong in math, and other folks, for various reasons, get assumed not to belong. They have that secret menu or not, right? And I think that there are lots of things that we're going to talk about today that contribute to that. But I think holding that idea in our minds, that metaphor, that this person who was assumed to not want the authentic Chinese food because of, his lack of Chinese language skills, or maybe the way he presented as not authentically Chinese to this particular group of people, that he actually did want that food and he loved that food and he was denied that food. And similarly, what's that secret menu of mathematics? Francis Su talks about a handful of assumptions that we make as educators around who gets to see that secret mathematical menu. And, one is that I can make your judgments about your math aptitude based on some other non-academic characteristic, the way you dress, your ethnicity, your language skills. And that, of course, is completely flawed, right? We know that people from all over the world and all different kinds of backgrounds, that every human being can learn mathematics. We might also, have prejudicial ideas about a student's mathematical abilities, their future trajectory based on their grades, what they're achieving in class, their academic performance. But of course, we know that grades are not the only indicator of a person's willingness to learn, of a person's ability to learn. He has this great line in the speech where he says, "The snapshot is not the trajectory." This moment in time that we see a student in front of us, this moment in time that we write curriculum for fourth grade, for ninth grade, that particular moment, that's not that individual's whole life trajectory in mathematics. And so when we're thinking about an individual student at a moment of time, we don't want to limit them to just the snapshot of who they are in this moment, but we want to keep in mind this trajectory of a growth that is available to them. Another assumption he talks about is that low performing students must be incapable or lazy. And I hope by now we all know that that's definitely not true, that often our low performing students have been marginalized in the math classroom, have been pushed out of math. They haven't had the opportunity to either have rigorous instruction, engaging instruction. Perhaps they haven't had the opportunity to see why math could matter to them. It's not an issue of capability, and it's certainly not necessarily laziness either, right? That it's our job as educators to engage our students and to make them want to perform in mathematics, to make them want to learn and talk about math. He has two other assumptions that are related to this secret menu idea, flawed assumptions, they're all, I hope you're noticing now. Another one is that mathematical teaching doesn't involve culture. And we've heard this so many times. Why do we need to talk about social justice? Why do we need to talk about culture when I'm teaching math? Math is above all of those human considerations. But of course, we know it's not, because mathematics is a tool for us to make sense of and impact our world. And our world is that we humans inhabit, that we humans create and co-create together, is a world of culture, right? And so culture is intimately tied up with mathematics. It's what I'm using mathematics for. He has a great example of a place that this comes up, right? In students' work. We say mathematics is free of culture, but then the examples that we use are highly cultured when we think about how we're teaching the mathematics. He has this example. The students were asked to estimate how many piano tuners lived in a city. It was an estimation task, right? To the writer of that problem, that seemed like a very reasonable question, right? Probably not too many, because how many people have pianos and how many people need a piano tuner? The students, though, came to him with all of these questions. What is a piano tuner? Is that a machine or a person? If you play a stringed instrument, you have an auto tuner, right? When I play my ukulele or my cello, I use my tuner to get all of my strings in tune, right? So is this a person they're talking about? And then they had no concept of how that a piano needed to be tuned. that it was a job performed by an individual, and they had no idea how many pianos might be in a city. This sort of world of having a piano in your home and having a piano tuner come and tune it was completely unfamiliar, an unfamiliar cultural practice to his students. And he realized that, like, wow, I thought that, you know, maybe mathematics could be this neutral thing where culture didn't come in, but we are communicating culture in the problem context that we present to students. So we need to be aware of that as well. And then finally, he has this idea that, you know, we might think teachers and, you know, curriculum designers, we might think we're doing a student a favor by telling them mathematics isn't for you. You know, maybe you should focus on language arts. It seems to me you're a history person, right? And when we do that, we shut down, again, a student's pathway for growth. We deny to them access to what is their intellectual inheritance as human beings, to use math, to understand math, to mathematize their world. We can use some Freire language to think, to read and write the world with mathematics, right? To engage and to get to use that tool equally, just like everybody else. And so I think I start with Francis Su because I find him inspiring. I find his desire to bring forth these virtues to be a nice guiding principle for me as I think through and try to enact a pedagogy for mathematics that is inclusive of all of my students, that celebrates and has an eye towards the growth of every single one of my students, no matter their cultural background. And in fact, you might say, instead of no matter their cultural background, with their cultural background explicitly included. That it's not just about removing barriers, it's also about inviting everyone in. And we're going to talk about these two ideas together in the next few slides. You know, the California Math Framework calls out 3 unproductive beliefs that contribute to deficit thinking. And this is from an NCTM publication. And that first unproductive belief is that math learning should focus primarily on practicing procedures and memorizing basic number combinations. That's what math is. It's practicing procedures and memorizing combinations. And we know, of course, in this virtual space, that is an unproductive belief, that mathematics is so much more. I don't want to debate the belief. What I want us to think about today is, what role do materials play in contributing to this belief amongst teachers and students? As you think through the curricula that you've seen, that you've experienced in your life, that your schools have adopted, or that you yourself have written and revised over the years, in what ways might we intentionally or unintentionally be, you know, sort of socializing this belief into people? Yes, giving one correct answer, having this answer key with just one correct answer all the time. Of course, mathematical problems often have, mathematical exercises, I should say, often have a correct answer. You know, when we're performing an operation, there isn't a lot of wiggle room there. But I think definitely how we get there. And if it's a true problem and not just an exercise, then it should also have multiple potential solutions, right? Depending on how you think about it. What else have you seen? Yes, thank you, Beth. Worksheets with no context and just numbers on a page. And my personal pet peeve is a page full of addition problems, a page full of multiplication problems with instructions at the top that says solve these problems. To which I think we are just acculturating students to ignore instructions, because it's so obvious that I'm supposed to solve the problems, that why did you write solve the problems at the top of the page, right? And so we're doubly hurting our students by communicating that math is just performing procedures, performing calculations, maybe just performing an algorithm, and that instructions are meaningless and are not necessary to be read. I think that it's important to think about how our curriculum encourage this thinking, you know, in our teachers and in our students, and to realize that even if we say math isn't just about practicing procedures and memorizing calculations, right? Even if we say that, if over and over again, my materials provide these pages to simply practice procedures and memorize number combinations, then I'm communicating that that's what math is, right? Yeah, wow. Another comment: in my old math textbooks, I would see the words clearly or obviously. Yes, also be on the lookout for we all know, we all agree, right? Who's we? Very, very good. NCTM offers a productive belief to counter this one, that mathematics learning should focus on developing understanding of concepts and procedures through problem solving, reasoning, and discourse. And these ideas should be so familiar to us now at this point in our webinar series. We've been talking about problem solving and reasoning and mathematical discourse, opportunities for discussion over and over again. But that's the key there, right? We want to make sure that the material, as you look through your material, you might even do a little data collection, right? To compare how many pages do I have that look like practicing procedures, and how many pages do the students see that are dedicated to developing an understanding of concepts and procedures through these authentic problems, right? The difference between a problem and an exercise, this is from Alan Schoenfeld, my grand advisor. Alan talks about how traditionally we have just exercises in mathematics curriculum, that the mathematics is removed from any real world context, and it's just that series of procedural problems over and over again. And that a true mathematical problem is that open-ended one, right? With those multiple solution pathways. And so this is the counter to that unproductive belief. And I think when we think about our curricula in the classroom, we want to be looking for what are the beliefs that are subtly being presented through this text? What are the underlying beliefs of the authors of the text that I can see coming up in the choices that they make of how to present material for students to interact with and for teachers to interact with? And then, maybe compare, like, do we have enough open-ended stuff to balance this out? Or are we unintentionally promoting this belief that math is just about procedures? Because as we all know, what we do is so much more important than what we say, and we have to back it up with the materials that we present to teachers and students. Another one, students need only to learn and use the same standard algorithms and the same prescribed methods to solve algebraic problems. Where have you seen this idea in curriculum? How have curricula contributed to this thinking? These beliefs are made up. Real teachers and students have them, right? You see them on social media of parents complaining about these new math. Why are they teaching students to do it this harder way? There's obviously the right way. You just borrow, you just invert and multiply, whatever it is, right? Where do we see this coming up in our curricula? How are our curricula partly culpable in building this belief amongst the people? Go ahead and drop it in the chat when you have a thought. Yeah, we love having problems that show a solution, right? Here's an example of how to solve this problem, but perhaps curricula needs to be more careful about showing multiple solution pathways that are both correct, that both arrive at a reasonable answer, right? We've gotten pretty good at including those problems where students have to identify and critique where another student, an imaginary student, might have gone wrong, a misconception, something like that, where we've gotten quite good at including wrong solutions, but we often only have one correct solution instead of demonstrating that there are multiple pathways, that there are multiple ways to solve true problems. Yeah, and an exit ticket that reinforces one particular method. This is a balance, I think, that y'all as curriculum designers have to think hard about, because we do want students to practice different strategies, right? And so how are we going to balance giving them access and giving teachers the ability to assess, are my students understanding this particular strategy or that particular strategy? How are we going to balance that with making sure that we're not suggesting that there is only one way to solve this particular problem? And I think it's going to have to do with showing multiple pathways all the time, multiple solution strategies, and really reinforcing that for our teachers and our students, because teachers grew up with these same curricula, right? And a lot of teachers are walking around with this idea that what math means is to everybody needs to learn the standard algorithm. This is how you multiply, right? So then the counter belief that we want to encourage in everything that we do, we want to have this behind this idea behind the math that we put in front of students, is that we all need to have a range of strategies to bring to solving problems, and that these include, of course, those standard algorithms, those procedures, but it's not limited to that. And you don't always need the standard algorithm. You know, a number talk is a great example of doing this, right? You know, I have everyone close their laptops, put their phones down, close their notebooks, and multiply in their heads. I'll give them a problem. 25 times 14 is my personal favorite math multiplication problem for a number talk. And then I show them. And with my undergrads, I do this at the start of every single class. Yes, multiplying is not the mathematical content I'm responsible for teaching them. But by doing that number talk every day, I am undermining that belief that there's only one way to do mathematics, because they share out and we compare the different strategies and we talk through all the different pathways that a person thought through as they solved the problem, right? As they did the exercise. So, you know, when you're providing that sort of warm-up activity for teachers, making it explicit to them that this isn't just about warming students up, this isn't just about like activating prior knowledge, that we're also undoing this belief that runs rampant throughout society that there's only one right way to do math. And by demonstrating in front of our students day after day, you know, page after page, they can start to see that, oh, actually, it is a range of tools that I have access to, and that I can choose which one is appropriate for the situation, which ones I like, that sort of thing. All right, one more unproductive belief for you to consider. Students can learn to apply mathematics only after they've mastered the basic skills. I have personal experience with this one. When I taught sixth grade, we were doing proportional reasoning. The other sixth grade teachers would say, we can't teach proportional reasoning to them yet because they don't have their multiplication facts memorized. And it was always so tragic to me, right? That they just can't. They can't learn about proportional reasoning until they've got a list of facts memorized in their heads, right? What other ways do we see this idea coming up that you have to have your basic skills first? Absolutely. Absolutely. You know, we've talked about this idea earlier in the webinar that, you know, students who are multilingual learners, students who don't yet have fluency in English, definitely can still learn mathematics, right? So it's not just the idea that basic math skills, but also basic, you know, language fluency, language skills are a prerequisite for learning math. And that's simply not true. Yeah, a lot as Emily brings up, anything involving math facts has this belief embedded in it. I think that's also true. Yeah, and then the idea that the word problem, the place where you get to finally put this math in action, is often at the bottom of the page. It's often called like an extension activity. After you've gone through all the disconnected rote practice of procedures, then you get to try to apply it in one little contextual word problem, right? And so that one is the aberration and not the norm of what mathematics is. That first I need to do all of these facts and then I get to apply. Then I get to apply it in my own thinking, rather than starting with the situation and trying to think about how we're going to solve it, right? And what thinking will help us here. I like that, Jade, thinking about math as a ladder versus a web. And we see V speaking about, I think we see this also in materials, overemphasize grouping students or diagnosing them and leveling them. There's a time and place for supporting unfinished learning, but it shouldn't mean preventing children from getting access to grade level content. Well said, thank you. You know, the solution when a student, isn't demonstrating to you that they have what you might imagine to be that prerequisite knowledge. For instance, in that 6th grade level team with those other teachers, and the teachers were concerned that they couldn't teach proportional reasoning because the students didn't have their multiplication facts memorized. And of course, you need to be able to see factors and multiples when you're looking at proportions. Well, what I suggest is that we provide a scaffold in that moment, right? That's what scaffolds are for, to amplify the grade level content so the students can think deeply about proportional reasoning. They don't have to waste cognitive activity on trying to memorize math facts, or they don't miss out on grade level instruction because we're going to go back and reteach 3rd and 4th grade. Instead, they got to use a multiplication chart. No big deal. I made them make the multiplication chart themselves. I always thought that was maybe going to help them memorize some of those facts so that in the future, if they had a teacher who had these deficit beliefs, they might have some of those basic facts memorized in their pocket. But for my teaching, I always provided scaffolds for when they had this gap in their preliminary understanding. No problem. We can still access grade level content with a scaffold, right? Yeah, good question about the Melissa's asking about iReady and those online or computer-based tutoring programs that are constantly assessing what a student understands before they can go on to the next harder thing, right? And if you get a question wrong, it gives you an easier one next. They are concerning, right? And I think we all know that a computer program isn't going to replace a teacher facilitating a discussion, a teacher facilitating an inquiry-based activity in the classroom. That because in the very first session, maybe the second session, we talked about how language and content knowledge, they develop between us before they are inside my own head, right? That it's learning happens socially. In response to our environment with the people around us. That's how human brains work, right? Well, at least that's the theory that I ascribe to. And the California Math Framework does too. It's the sociocultural framework, right? And so it's so very important that we don't think that we can always just constantly be assessing and leveling. Yes, we want to be responsive to what students are learning, but we don't want to deny them access to those deep, rich problems. Let's take a look at that productive belief. It shouldn't be a surprise to you at all, right? That students can learn. You could stop it right there, but can learn mathematics through exploring and solving, right? Exploring and solving these contextual math problems, that the problems that are based in real world situations. Thank you. As we go forward, and as you are looking at curricula in your future or you're designing curricula, I hope you keep these unproductive beliefs in mind so that you're on the lookout for, oops, am I unintentionally reinforcing this belief based on the way the pages are laid out, based on the examples that I give? A lot of our stuff today is subtle. A lot of the stuff we're going to be talking about are these somewhat subtle ways that we communicate norms and cultural practices around mathematics to teachers and students that are not productive, that are in fact deficit oriented. And we have to work hard to identify and uncover them. And then we'll also be talking about the things we can do to create more asset-based, right? Strengths-based messaging for our students and teachers. Fantastic. I'm going to show you another video. You've seen before these types of videos from ELSF where they share with us, oops, where's my thingy? Where they share with us some real life teachers working on this. And so you've seen an elementary school classroom, you've seen a middle school classroom, and now I want to show you a high school classroom. It's a group of 3 teachers working together. And I want you to be on the lookout for how are these teachers, revising this lesson that they're working with to really bring forth and notice and leverage the assets that their students are bringing to the classroom. Of course, they're multilingual students in particular, but think of all students also. Here we go. Enjoy.
My name is Brenda Melendres. I teach at CBLCC High School. I am currently teaching Integrated Math 1, Integrated Math 3, and Advanced Art.
My name is Josue. I teach Integrated Math 3, Pre-Calc, and AP Calculus.
My name is Jessica Avila, and I teach Integrated Math 2 for 10th graders and Statistics for 12th graders.
The English Learner Success Forum and faculty from San Diego State University partnered with 3 teachers from the Chula Vista Learning Community Charter School to redesign a high school lesson that focused on comparing linear and exponential rates of change. The goal of the redesign project was to highlight how teachers using high-quality instructional materials can create opportunities for multilingual students to learn robust mathematics.
In this sequence of lessons, the teacher's goal was to have the students do the card sort activity in the formative assessment lesson, representing linear and exponential growth, from the mathematics assessment project.
I think like in a very broad sense, our goals with respect to this lesson was like learning from the students what they thought or how they interpreted the word interest, and then from there introduce to them what interest meant in the math world. And so that meant kind of giving them the opportunity to share, and then from there showing them, which kind of relates to the math goals, showing them the patterns that exist within simple and compound interest, and then build off of that.
The teachers and SDSU team met and worked through the lesson together. The team discussed that the students would need to understand the key mathematical concepts, procedures, and associated terminology related to calculating interest. From this discussion, the team developed a 3-part lesson plan. In part 1, the teacher's goal was to assess students' prior knowledge related to interest and to introduce the mathematical meaning of interest as a percent change.
For day 1, we started off with the language. So I feel that was a very essential part to make that lesson, make it more applicable to what they know, to what they're already familiar with.
When you hear the word interest, what do you think about? Give me as many different meanings as you can.
All right, my people. So you might know this word, you might not know this word. You have beautiful people around you. Please take about 3 minutes to write as many different meanings of this word. All right, so we're ready to share, and I'm missing out.
Okay, so let's stop right there and take a look at the screen. So many different responses. Pick the top 2 that you would like to share with the class. Pick the top 2 from your list that you want to share.
Oh, interest rate as in money.
Are you going to say it?
Okay, group over there. What are your top 2 answers?
Simple and compound.
Simple and compound? Okay. Simple compound. What about in the back?
We have passion and interest. Oh, sorry, interest rate.
Interest rate. Okay, so interest rate. And how about activities and rate? And what about this group?
When you're not forced to do something, when you do what you want to, and personal liking.
Ooh, personal liking. Personal liking, how is that connected to interest? Personal liking.
Because personal liking is something that you are doing without it being like a task. It's more like something you want to do for yourself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that can also be considered interest, but it's not too much related to the math, right? But it is fair, because if we didn't specify, okay, so that this has to be about math, right? But there are many different interpretations on interest, and that was the expectation, to see it like from a different perspective. So personal liking can be interest rate. So there's a lot of connection with that interest. Hobbies, that can also be of interest. So different representation there. So just as there's different representations of that word, there's also different representations on how we can use the math to translate how interest looks like. So we're gonna move on to the next slide.
During part 2, students worked on a series of problems with a real-life context to examine the effects of increasing or decreasing a quantity by a percent. During this lesson, students worked in small groups and whole class and used graphs, tables, and equations to solve problems.
So we're gonna start with kind of like a check-in question. Hopefully it's related to something that you do every day in your life. Then I'm gonna show you a video that I think is pretty cool. And we're gonna do like a warm-up question that is related to that video. Okay? And then from there, we're gonna continue with the same topic that we started talking last class about simple and compound interest.
A 9.4% fee.
Me cobran el 7% y yo no sabía.
Lacio Carrillo discovered she was paid 7% more on top of her transaction. Both said they were surprised that the stores in San Isidro could add charges to their money exchange. Many of these money exchanges...
200 is what we're like starting with, so before going to la casa de cambio we have $200. 0.93, that's called a multiplier, and basically every time that, multiplier, okay, and the X is every time that you go to the casa de cambio to like exchange the money. So, can I share my cookie?
Finally, in part 3, the students worked on the card sort activity, matching graphs, tables, equations, and written descriptions of investment plans.
Okay, I finished.
What grade are you all in, by the way? Yeah, you're a senior. Nice. Are you going to go to the University of Oregon?
I feel like the cultural part would be just using their own language, their own words. A lot of different words came in to that, and maybe they were not about what the lesson was about, interest, because I also had a few students talking about interest as in interest, like you're interested in a person, but it just started building that curiosity on the students. And then day 2.
So for day 2, I think we connected the task to their culture in a sense. For example, I had a student from Peru, and he talked about how his money exchange is different from pesos as it is for dollars to his country. As an asset, right? We didn't feel like, like we let them discuss, and we use that as a good way of connecting with the task. I think that one of our goals was, like Josue mentioned, to go from an informal understanding of the word interest to a more formal understanding, which is basically the different representations of interest in investment. And I think that one of our goals was to make sure that this course was used so that students had the opportunities to share their learning. So students were talking about interest, maybe like interest in a different sense, but then later on, as the lessons progress, students were using the word interest in a more mathematical way. So that discourse was happening.
So I think that was the goal. So using their language, their own words, and then making that, like you said, so more formalized and embedding it into the what was needed to be covered in the standards, with the main focus on language. So especially since we have a group where 95%, 98% of the student population there is main language is Spanish speakers. Sometimes using their own words so they can make that better understanding. So it's not just random words that popped out in the math classroom, but they can see that connection.
0.07, and when we multiply that, that's supposed to give us a percentage, and the x on top of the 0.07 is the exponent. That's how many times it's repeated, repeated multiplication. So that's how I kind of figured it out. I don't really know how to explain it. I just like wrote it down.
They were able to share moments where they used, for example, Casa de Cambios, because, like, for example, once you brought that up, one student was mentioning about, what were you saying a second ago?
I remember I was introducing this idea of money exchange, and when I showed the students the video, I had students who already knew sometimes they have to pay a little bit more extra. And I think there was Said who said that. So they already came with that knowledge that I assumed they were maybe not gonna have. So that made the lesson a little bit more interesting, I say, and that also gave them access to what we were gonna talk about. We use the foldable as a way for them to summarize and write everything that they learned. They also had the opportunity to write a problem of their own, so kind of like making that thinking, taking that ownership in a sense. We also had a lot of opportunities for them to discuss. So it wasn't like the teacher was explaining. It was more like they have multiple opportunities to share, like think, parent, share, and then we also have like whole class discussions and small discussions as well.
And I feel like that went very smoothly on how we were giving them that independent time, parent share, and then that discussion. So I feel like that took a very important role in the entire lesson. So we planned 3 main tasks. Of course, in between there was like showing the Casa de Cambio video clip. There was the student presentation, so showing other students how one student can take ownership of their learning and present it in different ways, that is not just how the teacher teaches. But I feel like altogether that showed a lot of rigor to their learning. There was a lot that was going on, a lot that they learned, maybe without them even knowing.
I teach emerging bilinguals because I think of myself when I came from Mexico to the United States and all the struggles that I had to encounter. But I also think about those teachers who helped me out a lot. So I want to become one of those teachers.
With English learners, for example, would be because of what I can learn from them, how they view it, and it gives me a chance to see them grow, because I've seen in the last 4 years kids who started as freshmen with Menendez 4 years ago, and now they're seniors. Seeing them grow, seeing where they're at right now, it's quite amazing.
Fantastic. So thank you folks in the chat. I was trying to reply and someone else did, so thank you for that. I wonder if you can type in the chat now, what evidence of asset thinking did you see? This next, today we're talking about our 4th criteria in our rubric for reviewing instructional materials. Criteria number 4, the idea that materials are going to forefront, value, and use the assets of students, including their home language, experiences, beliefs, all in the teaching of mathematics. And so as we think about that video, we're just trying to wrap our heads around, like, what does it look like when our lessons are forefronting, valuing, and using the assets of students? What did you notice? Already someone typed in the chat about the teacher letting the students think about all their connections to the word interests. And who is this? Victoria. Thank you. Victoria said she could have easily just said, that's not the type of interest we're talking about today, or just defined it for them. But instead, she gave them that time to let it play out, right? And that time, then we can focus their attention instead of negating all of that background knowledge, saying it's not relevant here. highlighting it, right? Amplifying what is the definition of interest that we're going to be talking about in math. Pulling in their background knowledge, right? Earlier in the lesson, right? Those casa de cambio, if you don't know, that's a money exchange, right? Yeah, it was welcomed, and it was this real world situation that the students were aware of. That was the anchor for why a person might want to understand how to calculate an interest rate instead of an imaginary scenario, or instead of a scenario that's very unfamiliar to me, like a piano tuner. The teachers went and found a scenario, a real world moment when interest was going to be valuable to use, to understand, to make sense of, to mathematize, right? And connected it to the students' experiences. Very, very nice. All right, so this is our criterion. It has 3 parts this time. We're going to talk about indicator 4A first, and that's that materials activate and build on students' home and community mathematical practices, showing students how to elicit and affirm students' strengths and experiences and connect these to math learning. This indicator is doing some heavy lifting, so let's break it down a little bit. There are these researchers up at the University of Washington who are working hard right now on a project where they're trying to figure out how to promote asset-based, racially just, inclusive mathematics teaching that is also ambitious, rigorous mathematics teaching. And so they've been working with school leaders and with professional learning communities of teachers at schools. And they had this in a paper that I wanted to call out to you. And what the teacher did was she's a 3rd grade teacher. They're introducing multiplication, right? Thinking about multiplication. And so she sent the students home to interview their family members and ask their family members the question, what does multiplication mean to you? How does multiplication help you? How did you learn multiplication? This is a beautiful example of some prompts that could be in a curriculum, right? That this is a way for students to elicit students' home experiences, or teachers to elicit students' home experiences without making assumptions about what their home experiences are, right? What their home community practices are. So you start by asking, have the students go home and ask. And the students came back with amazing responses. Once a family member said, when I was a waitress, I multiplied every time I needed to figure out my tip. Or I use multiplication hundreds of times a day, every day, for my job as a roofer. Or I use multiplication when I figure out how long it will take and how much it will cost to do the laundry. Or finally, when I braid hair, I have to figure out how many braids will fit and the size of each braid. This is a great example for you all of how we might bring in students' home and community math experiences into the lesson. And notice that those 4 ideas, the tip, the laundromat, the roofing, the braiding, those weren't given by the math curriculum. Instead, the curriculum asked the teacher to have the students go and get that information and bring it back. And now we have 4 real-world contexts that are connected to students' experiences. And we've created the idea in both teachers and students that our family members have strengths in using mathematics to solve problems in their real life. That this isn't something that's coming from the outside with only one way of doing it, but that the people in our community, the grown-ups in our community, they're working with this stuff every day. And there are resources for me to learn about it. And it matters in our everyday lives. I think a common misconception that I hear sometimes is, well, how can I possibly make all of my lessons relevant to all of the students? California is an incredibly diverse state. We have students from every country on the planet who speak, numerous different languages. And even if 2 students are from the same home country, they might have vastly different cultural practices and background experiences. We know our multilingual learners are not a monolith, So how can we possibly create materials that are going to build on their home and community practices? Certainly we're going to be excluding someone, right? And instead, I think there's two keys to this. And please do type in the chat here, because I would love to know what you think. But I don't think we need to anticipate every single home and community practice. In fact, I think that would be dangerous and would lead to us making sort of generalizations and stereotypes about groups of people. Instead, we can do like was done in that previous slide. We can have teachers be guided in how to discover their students' home and community practices and how to link those to the math that they're teaching in the classroom. That's the key. And I am so looking forward to seeing what math curricula look like in the coming years, because with this, the math framework is asking us to be more inquiry-based, asking us to be more open-ended, right? And it's also asking us to connect math to our students' real lives. And so that means that the curriculum can't provide all the context anymore. The context has to be local. So how do we, when we're thinking about designing curriculum, or how do we, when we're looking at curriculum and deciding which one is right for my school, we want to be on the lookout for materials that guide our students to collect information about the local environment, to collect information about my students, their lives, their backgrounds, their families, and use that in the learning of math. So maybe it looks like a menu of possible contexts, or find your own that's relevant. All of them would work for this lesson. Or maybe it's a basic outline of some types of problems that would be used, and then you connect them in some way to students' lives. I'm not 100% sure all of the ways that you're going to find to connect to students' lives, but this is really critical because, and it's my last point here, what often ends up happening, and that I hear from teachers, is that the examples, the contexts that are in the problems in math books tend to come with a certain viewpoint, tend to assume a particular cultural background, a shared culture that might not be the culture of the students in the classroom. Like that example with the piano tuners we just saw. My 6th grade students once had a problem that was about stocks. And they were asking me if they meant that was something to do with livestock, with cattle. They had no concept of stocks and bonds and investments and the finance markets and stuff like that. Another teacher, I was doing some professional development for some teachers in Sacramento, and they knew that I was going to see you all soon. And they said, can you please tell them to stop making all of the problems about football? In my math curriculum this year, every single problem is about football, right? And so that's another thing to look through as you're looking through your curriculum, as you're doing an audit of what experiences, what cultural backgrounds, what practices are highlighted in it. Don't try to have every single different way of being in the whole world there, and don't make assumptions about who the students are, but also don't have just one way of thinking about the world, one set of cultural practices. And that might look like having people from different cultural backgrounds look over the material and compare, because you might not even see it. You might think, oh, I have a diverse amount of different kinds of problem contexts, but actually they're all coming from one perspective, from one shared experience. And so that's what we need to be on the lookout for. And then, of course, we don't just want to, connect. We need to help. So we're building on here. We need to show the teachers how to elicit, and then how to affirm the student's strengths. And then finally, to connect them to mathematics learning. And some suggestions here, you've seen these before, participatory or participation structures are going to be helpful here. Participation structures like the compare and connect, the collect and display that we just saw happen in the video, right? That was allowing the teacher to elicit and affirm the student's background knowledge about interest. And then she used that to connect to their math learning. In other videos and other webinars, we've also seen like anticipatory activities where the students say, you know, get together and move around the room and write everything that comes to mind when they looked at the picture of the diagram showing volume, right? And then, of course, our problem context. Let's not forget our problem context. We want to make sure that they are diverse and that especially there's room for teachers to modify them to connect their particular classroom context and what's important to their students. Yeah, and I see Melissa saying, when you say football, it's likely assumed to be American football rather than football from around the world, which we call soccer in the United States. Yes, there's so many assumptions in our curricula about a shared background knowledge that isn't actually shared, right? And that's probably related to who we all are as teachers, who we all are as curriculum developers, things that seem taken for granted. People know about this. This is a great example, right? We have to be very careful to make sure that we're providing a variety, right? And most importantly, I would say the opportunity for teachers to elicit from the particular students that are right in front of them. A quick example, right? A quick example of a way we could do this. A mathematical language journal. You may have seen something like this before. This is an example that's related to a statistics unit. And you can see that there are 4 prompts that the students are going to work through. They're going to be thinking, this is amplifying the language, right? Really highlighting what language is in use. But notice how much openness there is for the students to respond and bring their own interpretations, their own experiences into making sense of the language that they're encountering in the math classroom. And the student is letting us know what they know. This activity is eliciting from them what their information is, and it's presenting it, right, as a strength. You know this stuff. You have the ability to think it through and make sense of language. And your connections to the real world outside of school are valuable and appropriate to bring into the learning of math. Especially that last one, right? The world is filled with data. Why do you think it's important for you to know how to analyze statistical data outside school? So, you know, first we go through the first 3 questions are really thinking about the language precisely, and then opening it up and thinking about the purpose of using that language. Back in webinar number 2, we talked about language exists for a reason, right? We don't just memorize words out of context, but we learn them and use them when we need them, right? And so connecting to students, or helping students to connect, when would I need to use this? When would this be important to me? Why does it matter in my community to know about variability, to know about distributions and things like that? So mathematical journals are a great example. We've seen so many examples over these webinars of ways that we can elicit students' background knowledge, of ways that we can elicit students' strengths and assets, students' home and community practices to really draw out what they're already experiencing and then make that link, make that connection for and with them to the mathematical language and the mathematical content. So these are like, if you had to take away 3 rules for how you're going to help materials connect to students' experiences, I would say it's these 3 things. That we want to make sure that there's a variety of information about our students, about their families and their communities, that teachers are eliciting both the informal strategies that students and families use, their students' interests, their experiences with math in and outside of school, and their experiences with math in and outside or in their home communities, right? Or maybe in a community that they left, right? And have come to move here. They might, like the student who is from Peru, he has an experience of being from Peru and then sending money back to Peru and needing to change it, right? These are all ways that we can elicit a variety, right? Not just how many different ways can I multiply 25 times 14, but other things about my life. And that can't be an a priori thing that comes from above. You can't make assumptions about what your students' experiences are going to be. We need the curriculum to help teachers see that they need to ask students and then give them some guidance about connecting those experiences to the math learning. You know, that teacher who, the research paper that talked about how do you use mathematics, right, in your everyday life. The teacher in that research paper, after she collected all that information from her students, she turned to the coaches who were doing the research project and said, but what do I do with it now? Right? And I think that's the role that curriculum developers can play. It's one thing to say, ask your students to go home and ask them when they use multiplication. It's the next step that we want to take that lays out for teachers. Now that you have that information about your students' experiences, now that you have that information about their home and community practices, here's how you're going to connect it to the lesson. Here's how you're going to incorporate it into the lesson. It might be the warm-up activity today is going to be this, work with these numbers. You're going to multiply 25 times 14. But prompt teachers to use one of the examples that students brought into you about their home and community use of multiplication, and use that as the context for solving the problem. You know, we don't always, especially as the math, gets into the upper grades, we don't want to always give teachers free rein to choose every part of the problem. First of all, teachers don't have the time, nor do we have the background knowledge that a curriculum developer has to think deeply about which numbers, which values are going to be most effective for the students learning in this moment, right? But providing the shell and then advising them on how to connect it to their students' lives, what they've learned about their students, that can make for really powerful math learning. Also, we want to make sure, just to say it, right, that those suggestions for eliciting information is done in a respectful way, right? You're not saying, okay, every student has to go home and then come back and tell me about what's going on at home, right? We want to be comfortable, give students room to decline to share about their lives if they don't feel like that's the right thing for them to do. So you want to remind teachers of that as well, that maybe not all students will want to share or feel comfortable sharing, and that's okay. You just are interested in eliciting a handful of different experiences. And then, of course, what to do with that information, right? Make sure that that's done in a respectful way too. And we might caution teachers not to generalize about groups of people, about cultural groups, about groups that share a language or a country of origin or a race or ethnicity, that this isn't about generalizing, that this is about getting to know the practices of the individual students who are sitting in front of me. That is the key. That brings us to criterion number, or indicator number 4B. So now that we've thought about how materials are going to activate and help us elicit students' home practices, then we want to say that we need materials to also explicitly guide teachers to create opportunities for students to use their home language to express, not only for learning math, but to express their culture and identity. And the math frameworks, has a statement about this explicitly. They say that teachers might listen for the mathematical ideas being expressed by students, noticing how students might draw on multiple language bases like translanguaging or extra-linguistic communication, such as gesturing and using representations, right? So the California Math Framework is telling us explicitly that teachers should be listening to their students' language use, and that translanguaging, using multiple languages, we might sometimes think of it as code switching, right? Spanglish, any of those sorts of terms that we've heard throughout time, that not only are those allowed in the math classroom, but that teachers should be attending to the ways that students are working within the language, with the language resources that they have available to them. Because if teachers are only looking for students to use a vocabulary word, then they're going to miss that opportunity when students are grappling with an idea without using that particular word. My advisor did a lot of work on this particular idea earlier in her career. And she, in one of her papers, she talks about how students are working with linear equations and they're trying to make sense of slope. and the y-intercept, right? And it's all about, they started using all of this language about steeper and not as steep, and they started connecting to this hill that they walked up when they were coming home from school. Where's the ground? This is the hill. All that kind of gesturing and informal language, and they were doing all of this, switching back and forth between English and Spanish in that particular context. And she, as the teacher researcher, was paying careful attention to the mathematics that they were talking about, so that she could connect it to those canonical ideas, that she could connect it to slope and y-intercept. What you're talking about here, right? And so it's not enough to say, like, have the students turn and talk about slope, right? We want the teacher to know, what kinds of ideas might I hear and should I be on the lookout for? And to help them, when I was a teacher, I really needed this help. I needed to know what I should be listening for and what kinds of ideas might come up in my classroom that I could use as a leverage to connect to the math idea. I didn't have enough mathematical background knowledge at that time myself. I didn't have the content knowledge as a teacher to really understand what I should be listening for. So some examples of the kinds of things students might be saying, the kinds of ideas we want to connect to, would be really helpful here. And then, of course, I really just want to highlight the second part of this indicator, that, it's not just about my home language is a resource for learning math. Of course, all of us here today, we're most interested in students learning math. But an important part of having an asset view of students, of forefronting students' backgrounds, their experiences, is also giving them the opportunity to express their culture and their identity in the math classroom. As Francis Su is saying, when we look around at math and science in the world, we don't see an equal representation of the people in our world in math and science. So I think this is a call that it's an absolute justice issue that we give students, especially students who are from identity groups that have historically been minoritized and marginalized in math, who we don't see in STEM jobs and in higher education, studying STEM subjects, right? We need to make sure that they have an opportunity to express their culture and identity in the elementary math classroom, in the middle school math classroom. And that's going to look like them being able to use their home language, use their home practices, right? And so then what could that possibly look like, Julianne? I know you're thinking, what does that look like? And I think we want to draw our attention to the language in the indicator here, where it says materials explicitly guide teachers. And this is where I think, because if we don't explicitly guide teachers, our teachers may have taken for granted beliefs. They may have ideas from their own prior experiences that suggest that students shouldn't be using their home languages, that that's not productive for learning math. Those unproductive beliefs we looked at earlier, and we know other productive beliefs related to multilingual learners, a lot of teachers hold those unproductive beliefs. They are an inheritance from the culture that we all share, right? From the years and years of math textbooks that they've experienced. So the curriculum has to counter that by explicitly telling teachers, we need to create opportunities for students to use their home languages. And it can be very simple. This is not a super complex thing. Here's an example from a Mars task. I think we've even looked at this task. This is the mixing the fizzy orange drink and how much soda water and how much orange juice, right? And the teacher guides gives this language to say to the teachers. They tell the teachers to say, this task is about making a fizzy orange drink by mixing different quantities of orange and soda. You, students, are going to compare how orangey the drinks will taste, as well as working out the amount of orange and soda needed to make fizzy orange with a similar orangey taste. We see that everyday language, orangey, we see that connection to things that students might know about. Kids know about mixing drinks, right? That's something that a lot of kids have experience with. But notice that nowhere does it say, okay, they're going to talk about it. You can tell them that they can use whatever language helps them make sense of it. And just by adding that as a line in the instruction for the teacher to say, we're going to counter that unproductive belief. We're going to counter that deficit thinking that my home language isn't valued in this classroom. We need to explicitly include because we have been implicitly and explicitly excluding students. And so to counter these deficit narratives and to promote equity for our multilingual learners and all our learners in math classrooms, we need to take that extra step. And it may only look like a sentence in the instructions. Maybe it's sometimes a sentence that as part of the script that teachers might read aloud, or it might be a direction for the teacher just as a reminder, right? I'll let you choose how and when they're appropriate. But the key for this indicator is that guidance for teachers is made explicit, that it's not assumed that teachers believe that home languages are valuable for learning. We need to say it explicitly to them over and over again. Let's see. William has a side question. Does anyone have a go-to or favorite book recommendations for discussing connecting students' funds of knowledge, cultures, and experiences? Well, I'll let you all talk about that in the chat. Thanks, William. You're right. I'm not going to address that right this second, but I have some ideas too. If you want to email me or if we have time at the end, we can discuss, but I'll trust the group mind to give you some resources there. Does anyone have any thoughts about this idea of explicit guidance for teachers? Does it seem silly to you? Do you ever feel like maybe there will be pushback from teachers that you're getting in the way of their independence and the idea that teachers are competent? Does it feel paternalistic in that way? Or does it seem like, yes, this is an easy change for us to make? What are you all thinking about this indicator? Yeah. Jessica's bringing up for newer teachers, this idea of explicit guidance is super helpful. Yes, if you have a teaching credential, you remember being a student teacher and being so overwhelmed with all of the things you had to keep track of, that even if you have the idea that home languages and practices are an asset, even if your teacher preparation program taught you that, you might become overwhelmed. And we know that teachers, it doesn't matter what we tell them in their teacher preparation education programs, that once they get into school, it's the culture of the school and their own experiences as students growing up that are most influential in the way that they teach. So we can't count on our universities to undo this sort of deficit practice that's been going on in math classrooms, because all of the teachers who are currently teaching experienced math classrooms that did this to them, right? And so they might be carrying around this taken for granted belief without even realizing it. So we want to be explicit about just reminding them home and everyday language is a great thing to use here. Elicit it from your students. Does anyone know any words in other languages? That sort of thing. Excellent. Thanks, everyone.
Juliana, may I say a word really quickly?
Absolutely.
This one personally resonates with me because of my time in the classroom, and I would have really benefited. I taught with the Connected Mathematics program in grades 6 through 8, which I absolutely love, and I taught a really diverse set of students in which I couldn't leverage I did have Spanish, but I couldn't leverage it because of the diverse languages of the students I taught. And so I would have greatly benefited from this in the classroom. And I just hear Lily Wong Fillmore in the back of my head. I've been attending the ELSF Science of Reading webinars. And one of her huge messages was teachers are bombarded and have so much to read. And so I do often feel a push in my own work life of wanting to include pieces like this, and also recognizing it adds to the length of what teachers need to read to prepare for a lesson. And so I wonder if you've thought about that at all, and if you have any thoughts or ideas about that.
Yeah, I agree. And that's why and I'll take anyone else's thoughts on it as well. Please speak up. But it is true that sometimes the teacher materials can be so lengthy, right? And I don't really have time to read 10 pages before I, teach a lesson. And that's why I think I pull out, we talked about a lot of deep ideas about this indicator, but at the end of the day, this could be as simple as just reminding students when you're writing out the instructions that you might read aloud to students, having that sentence in it that says, and you can use whatever language is good for you, right? Make sure that you're, using your everyday language, any home languages, those are welcome here. Something like that in the instructions, and not every single time necessarily, but regularly will help to remind us that that's a thing we can do. Does anyone else have a thought on that? Cool. I'll keep an eye out for it in the chat if you're typing, and otherwise we'll go on to our third indicator. So 4C talks about a classroom culture that encourages student participation and agency for language development. And here you might think, oh, Julianne, we just mentioned how curricula are too long and teachers don't have enough time to read, 10 pages of material before they go in and teach. And now you're asking me to give them guidance about the classroom culture. Yes, we are. So let's think about that. What is classroom culture? And what role do the materials play in creating and maintaining classroom culture? Take a moment and think about that second question. What role do the curricula play in creating and maintaining classroom culture? And as you have ideas, drop them in the chat. Because it's not just the teacher that creates a classroom culture. Christina, do you mean, I don't understand your comment. Christina wrote, is it okay to have discussions? Is it okay to have unfinished thinking? Do you mean in terms, people are adding in. Yes. Even when examples of good thinking, even when mistakes are made. I see, yes. That the materials can let us know that these are okay, that this can promote a positive classroom culture, that I may not be all the way to the perfect, most elegant solution, right? But that's okay, it's part of the process. I think multiple solutions, showing more than one way, showing example student work that represents a variety of English proficiency, right? That shows students using different kinds of representations, different resources, including gestures. There's so much use of technology now. As I go into classrooms and watch my student teachers practicing being teachers, I'm amazed at how much they're using the screen, and they're using videos to support them. So why not have students in those videos who represent a variety of different backgrounds and linguistic fluencies? Let's see, what else are you coming up with? Materials that promote and invite opportunities for students to read, write, speak, and listen with rich problems. Yes, right? Getting to use all 4 language domains with rich problems, right? That helps to create a classroom culture where we're interested, engaging. Another person is saying, oops, I lost it. Be closed. If the curriculum asks a lot of closed-ended questions, it encourages students to believe that every question has a single correct answer, and all they need to do is find it. If the curriculum asks open-ended questions, it encourages students to do more thinking about what if and what else. Beautiful, Melissa. Thank you. Again, we might do an audit of our curricula and say, Does this curriculum have a balance of open and closed questions? Does it have a balance of practicing facts as well as exploring genuine math problems, genuine problems in the world that I can mathematize, right? It's subtle. It's a lot of it is implicit, and we have to really shine a light on it, bring out that magnifying glass and look deeply to how are our materials contributing to our classroom culture. This doesn't necessarily mean tell teachers to be open to all students' backgrounds. Tell teachers that they need to make sure students have a growth mindset, right? Some of that, but it's also like, what do we do in the materials ourselves to communicate that? And then someone else is saying around indicator 4B, thank you. Even 1 to 2 examples of ways teachers have gathered info from students and then used it. Yeah, it's really helpful. That's a great idea, Melissa. Thank you. All right, let's see what the framework has to say about classroom culture. It's a long one. When students are engaged in meaningful investigative experiences, they can come to view mathematics and their own relationship to mathematics far more positively. By contrast, when students sit in rows watching a teacher demonstrate methods before reproducing them in short exercise questions unconnected to real data or situations, the result can be mathematical disinterest or the perpetuation of the common perspective that math is merely a sterile set of rules. This is where those implicit ideas that we communicate with the types of materials that we put in front of students are going to contribute to what the classroom community looks like in mathematics. I think that in some ways, the math curricula has a power to shape the mathematics classroom that may not be present in other subject areas. Perhaps because we have this huge mountain of these unproductive beliefs and these ways of doing things and these norms of what math class looks like to battle that have not been productive for all of our students, that have not been reaching all of our students. And think of the unlocked mathematical potential in the world if we created math classrooms where all of our students felt welcome, where all of our students were willing to take risks and learn. You know, it also is about creating space for students with a wide range, right, of social identities to feel that they can access the mathematical ideas and they feel a sense of belonging in the mathematics community. Does anyone know who any of these 4 people are? They might all be unfamiliar to you. The first person I've only recently learned about. This is Julio Cesar de Mello y Sousa, I think is how you say that name. But I may be terribly mispronouncing it. Yes, Christina. On the right, we've got W.E.B. Du Bois. Oh, yes, you are supposed to be seeing pictures. Jody, can you not see 3 characters at the bottom of the screen? Are other people having trouble seeing those? Okay, so some people can see them. Jody, you might mess with your Zoom screen and see if they pop up for you. You may have minimized me somewhere. Thanks, everyone. Yeah, so we've got W.E.B. Du Bois on one side, and we've got Julio on the other side, and you may not know who this character in the middle is. So first on the left is Julio, and this character is a good guess, Melissa. This character is known for writing fiction books in which he was born in 1895, died in 1974. So it existed his whole life before I was on the planet. But he was thought of as being a real innovator for using stories and games to engage students in learning math skills. And he wrote these great books, one called The Man Who Counted, in which like the hero uses extraordinary math superpowers to battle dangerous enemies and win fame and fortune, right? And as an example of a Latino man right? A man from South America who's a mathematician and contributed great creativity and art that was connected to mathematics as well. And most of us have never heard of this person, right? And why not? Why have they been excluded from mathematics teaching? The person in the middle is Kine Santos. Kine was born in the Philippines and then moved to Canada as a young person, and they have been a contestant on Drag Show. So that connection to RuPaul was a great connection to make. They've also become big on social media. They show up on TikTok and Instagram. Your students may have seen them before, and they do a lot of mathematics education. They're sort of a math ambassador. They have a new book that just came out called Math in Drag. And while, you may not share Kine's material with students at all levels, I find that the content is in general a little bit upper level math. Knowing that this person exists, that there's this drag queen, there's this young queer person out there who's, grew up in the Philippines and then moved to another country, right, might really make me connect with mathematics. In fact, I can tell you that for sure it does, because in my own reviews from students at the university, when I use Kine's materials, he makes great TikToks about statistics ideas. And you can see that facts don't care about your feelings is one of them that I use, right? My students have written time and time again in their evaluations of my teaching that using these TikToks was the first time they ever saw a queer person or a gender nonconforming person connected to mathematics. A student once wrote, "I didn't know queer people did math." Right? And so just having representations of folks from different identity groups, folks from different cultural backgrounds can be really powerful for our students, making them feel that their identity is represented in the world of math, that they are welcome here, right? And then the last character, you all guessed him, that's W.E.B. Du Bois, right? And you may have heard of double consciousness and other things about Du Bois, a brilliant man, right? First Black graduate of Harvard, like quite an amazing character. But what I only recently in the last few years learned is that he created some beautiful data visualizations that were describing the reality of life after emancipation. He wanted to communicate, Europe was really interested in what was the plight of Black folks in the United States now after we had done the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th and 14th Amendments. And W.E.B. Du Bois was worried about representing his community in a way that only showed poverty, right? In a way that didn't also demonstrate the strengths that they had and their rich culture. So he combined photographs of folks in the South and all around the United States at the time with these beautiful data visualizations that he got a whole crew of people at a university to work on. He founded one of the first sociology programs. I forget at what university now, apologies. But they were beautiful, collected all that data and then beautiful full color handmade visualizations that really explained why Black Americans were being held back, right? So that it was the combination of these ideas that it wasn't something inherent in Black folks in 1890 or in any time, right? But that there were these structural factors, and we can see that in the data. So just 3 examples for you to give you a taste of the kinds of folks whose stories we might tell, right? We have artists, we have activists, we have folks who study all different kinds of math and communicated about it for different reasons and different purposes. But when we have that diversity in who we're showing students are the mathematicians of the world, they might have that opportunity to see themselves. So I would very much encourage you to go do some research, find some more examples of people we can highlight who have not been highlighted. They can be from, ancient history, and they can be existing right now today in our world, making TikToks for us. This seems at first to not be connected specifically to our multilingual learners, but I want us to think about it as we go through. You may have, as you've been investigating the new math framework, you've probably come across this list of 5 components of equitable and engaging mathematics, right? The first one is that we want to make sure we're teaching around big ideas. This is about conceptual understanding, making connections across discrete little mathematical content standards and seeing the big ideas that connect math. And this is going to help our students make sense of math, make connections, and develop their conceptual understanding, right? We've talked a lot about number 2, open and engaging tasks. We had a whole webinar just focused on that. Number 3 is teaching towards social justice, and we're going to talk more about that in a second. Number 4, inviting student questions and conjectures, right? If we want our classroom culture to be a space that's equitable, to be a space that's engaging for our students, we want to make sure that we're constantly inviting their questions and their conjectures. And that means that it has to be a true invitation, right? Which then says something about how we respond to their questions and conjectures. And so what role can materials play in promoting a welcoming space, a risk-taking space? And it's okay that I made a mistake in my thinking. It's okay that that conjecture led to a dead end. Maybe having examples of conjectures that led to a dead end, and then a person, the mathematician, right, took another direction. That will promote the kind of environment that's engaging our students. And then, of course, prioritizing the students' reasonings, the students' justifications. So most of these are very familiar. We've talked about them in a lot of different places. I wanted to highlight them because I've never put them on a slide altogether for you before. So if you haven't read about this in the framework, it's one of the big ideas. I encourage you to take a look. But let's dig in for a moment just to the teaching towards social justice idea. And what the framework tells us is that, I love it, they use Freire for us, right? They say first, students need to read the world by learning to use mathematics to highlight inequities. Then they write the world. In other words, they learn to change it with mathematics. These are the drivers of instruction, or excuse me, the drivers of investigation that are in the math framework. The why are we doing math? To make sense of all our world, to make predictions about our world, and to impact our world. And there's so much information about teaching math for social justice. There's so many videos of kids saying, this is the first time math ever felt meaningful for me. There's a big difference between using real life things to teach about math. Like if I'm learning about probability, yes, I do sometimes open my sock drawer in the dark, and I do have a chance of pulling out mismatched socks. But I'm never going to use math for that, right? I'm never going to calculate a probability when I'm reaching for socks in the morning. It is an inauthentic problem, and it is boring, and it is meaningless, right? Instead, how can we create problems that are connected to real issues that kids care about? And I have 2 little examples here. There's a bazillion examples in the world and many more inside your heads that will be pulled out in the coming months and years and put into curriculum. The one on the right, I know you can't read everything. I didn't intend you to be able to. The one on the left is called Stop in the Name of Safety. And the students are investigating how much distance the driver needs to have in order to stop, depending on how fast they're going, right? So some great 7th grade math content around rate and all of that kind of stuff, but then also connected to an important issue in the world that, like, driver safety, having following distance, making sure you're going the speed limit because that's the safe speed in this environment. Why is the speed limit 25 in a neighborhood near where kids might be walking to school and it's 65 on the freeway? What is important about safety and why does it exist? So you can see that this question isn't particularly controversial, right? Being related to social justice I don't think you have to necessarily worry about a big backlash from school boards or school communities because this is very controversial. Things that are not controversial at all are very important justice issues for kids, like, can I walk to school safely? What speed limit do we need to set at around a school so that cars can stop in time not to hurt kids, right? The other example is one about school segregation. So they're looking at Knox County. They have the demographics for the schools, and students are later asked to make different representations of that data and draw conclusions. I think this is, I don't think we can highlight enough that this is important. We talk about wanting to have real world examples. We talk a lot about the importance of the why for the math, that we use math as a tool to read and write our world, to make sense of it, to make predictions, to change things. But if we don't have those kinds of examples in our curriculum, then students have just learned how to only hammer a nail in wood shop and not how to use hammers and nails in the world to build things, right? To solve the problems in their lives. And I think we underestimate our students when we think that they can't handle bigger issues. So I encourage you also then to think about like how engaging it's going to be for students and how powerful they're going to feel when they are mathematizing real problems in the world. We know that we saw the one about water with those middle school students comparing plant-based foods and meats, right? And the water usage. There's lots of issues that can be brought up. And I think that we can do so in a way that's inclusive of everyone, because at the end of the day, like math is really powerful for thinking about how we distribute our resources, for thinking about how we keep our communities safe and healthy. And that's something that kids care a lot about too, right? And so that's what it means to teach towards social justice. And now I would love if you all would take just a few minutes and let's brainstorm together, just dump them into the chat. What other kinds of topics would be related to this social justice idea for math, right? That what other ideas could, we incorporate into our teaching and into our curricula that would be helping students to see that math is something that they use in their real world to impact it. What topics come up for you? Yeah, Heidi right away has got it ready to go. Financial literacy, like compound and simple interest rates, credit card debt, how I'm going to pay for college. Yeah, social media, broadband internet access, what's a living wage, grocery stores versus liquor store locations in a community. I've seen several projects where students map what kinds of foods are available in different communities. I saw another project where students looked at who plays the lottery because they had access to data about where more lottery tickets were sold. And they were realizing that the more lottery tickets were purchased in poor communities. Geometry into gerrymandering, very nice. Redlining and rent. Disparities in access to quality education, comparing funding per student in different districts, analyzing standardized test score gaps. The distribution of grocery stores in Gary, Indiana. Nice. Climate change, the criminal justice system. Environmental justice. What about green space? How that affects the temperature, right? Local stewardship initiative to keep the Great Lakes clean. Nice. Economic indicators such as the GDP, literacy rates, and life expectancy across countries. Keep them coming. I hope you're all going to save the chat at the end of this meeting today because you're coming up with amazing ideas. Income inequality. I saw one online that was using geometry and students had to draw different kinds of triangles to decide on the best placement for a water treatment plant in a community. So they're looking at where people lived and what kind of triangle would best serve that community. Yeah, who gets permits to sell legal marijuana? If I was teaching high school, absolutely. Those kids would all be very interested that day, right? I saw another one where students were talking, had the opportunity to collect data in their own school about who had space to talk during small group and whole class discussions. because they read a news article that said that girls don't talk as much as boys in the classroom. And so then they did a whole, project where they collected and analyzed data in their own classroom and gave them the opportunity to reflect on their own practices in their own community, right? Are we being equal? Are we being equitable in our conversations right here? Yeah. You're not able to save the chat? Okay, I will put our tech team on saving the chat so that we can put these in a list for you, because these are really great ideas. And I hope you can see how engaging they would be for students, and they would help students to see, if I go back over here, back to our criteria, that, that idea of agency, right? That there's agency in my developing of my mathematical knowledge, and my developing of my language is for a purpose that I'm passionate about, which is a better world. Beautiful. So then as we kind of start to wrap up and we're thinking about, where we're going from here, take a second and think back, like everything that you saw happen in that video, how the home languages and practices were forefronted in the video, in the way the vocabulary was brainstormed in the beginning. It was affirmed both by being in the classroom, having a video about money exchange in the classroom, made that cultural experience valid. It affirmed it for the students. Instead of only having examples that are from a cultural experience that's very different from my own, right? You saw like, oh, my own home practices right here, right? Students' beliefs about maybe being surprised about how much money exchange costs, right? All of that was there in that video. And our goal now, the videos that you've seen, all three of them, they've been about teachers needing to modify curriculum in order to make it better for their multilingual learners, in order to make it in order to help them elicit and leverage their students' assets that they bring to the classroom, both for their language learning and their mathematics learning, right? Now we have all of these things that we've been thinking about. How can we start embedding them in the curriculum in advance, so teachers have to do less of that behind the scenes work? And so next month, we're going to be on our very last session, and we'll be talking about what always comes last, is that idea of how are we going to assess this stuff? If we know that disciplinary language and content develop together, how are we telling teachers to formatively assess students' use of language in the context of math reasoning over time? Because right now what we have is a lot of great assessments. We're doing great at formative assessments, right, throughout a unit, advising teachers on how to keep an eye on students' content knowledge and the progression of that. But if we're saying that language development matters too, matters equally, because math content and language development are going to develop simultaneously, they're intertwined, how are we supporting teachers to formatively assess their students' language development in mathematics as well? So we're going to dig into that next month. We're going to talk about language goals and the assessments. We're going to talk about how we can guide teachers in gathering and analyzing and using data, and how they might communicate that with students and their families, as well as other teachers and staff. It's going to be an exciting day, all about assessment. And then we'll also have some time to review all 5 criteria and think about together, looking at all 5 together, and think about how we can use them to really push our curricula to the next level, to be fully supportive of our multilingual learners, and imagine the just excitement in the classes of all the students who adopt that curriculum, right? When they see themselves represented, when their teacher is eliciting information about their home experiences, when their identity is not only allowed to be there, but is welcome, affirmed, and celebrated in the math classroom. And then I'm just imagining this 20 years down the line, where we've got all this population of people who are numerate, who've got some mathematical literacy, who aren't afraid of math, we stop hearing people say, I'm not a math person. right? And instead we see that we can all be math people. So that's my dream. And I do hope to see you next week. In the meantime, before you skedaddle out of here, if you would please take our survey. I do always look at it. It helps me think about what to put in more for the next one, or what to design for a follow-up, that sort of thing. So this is your link to the survey. And then in taking the survey, you will of course get a link to the recording of this video. And I'll make sure that somehow we include some of these great ideas about teaching for social justice topics that we all brainstorm together. I'm going to leave this up for 1 second here. And then it's also in the chat. And then leave you with this to see. So if you want to get in touch with us, we would love to work with you. If you're someone who's in charge of adopting curriculum, we can come and train your adoption team on how to think through these criteria and think about which curriculum is going to be right for your school, your context. And if you're a developer, we'd also love to work with you and help get into the nitty-gritty, right, of how this particular lesson can be made better for our multilingual learners, can really affirm their assets and not reinforce some of these deficit norms that are insidious. I hope you have a beautiful end of May and beginning of June, and I will see you all in 31 days. I look forward to it.